This chapter is about early Greece, and it begins about 1000 BC. If you remember from chapter 1, where we talked about the Mycenaeans and the Minoans, and that both of those cultures were completely wiped out, this would be after that, after the cultures were wiped out, and then we have the Dark Ages of Greece, and the change from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age. This is in that time period after the collapse of the Mycenaean culture, when the Greek culture is really just beginning to rediscover and to rebuild itself. There are three periods we're going to cover. The Heroic Age, so named because of the heroes in battle. Much of the literature, much of the artwork of this time period shows us heroes in battle. Then the Age of Colonization, when the Greeks started spreading out to other parts of the known world and colonizing, beginning Greek colonies in those areas of the world. And then the Archaic period, which is named after the sculptures that were done during that time period. We begin with the Heroic Age. This is after the Mycenaean culture has been wiped out, and that culture did have a strong central government, but now there is none. And so the people have assembled and they have grouped themselves into what is called a city-state. The different areas of the country were separated by mountains, and so in each major area, then what would develop would be a city that had the same power of a state because it had its own laws, its own traditions, its own names, sometimes its own language. So there was not a central government of Greece. It was a tribal society with no formal government, set up with tribes and clans and fighting men and elders who ruled the society. There was a ruling class with noblemen who formed a council, then the fighting men who formed the agora and who voted. Very patriarchal society. But the women were free. They were actually freer than they would be later during the Golden Age of Greece. So the main activities of this time period were fighting, hunting, and agriculture. While, most of the artwork and literature comes from the cities, as a whole, it was a very agrarian society. And, they had to grow enough to eat. And then they were fighting, of course, with one another for control of power. Three main qualities of their society were xenia, which means guest or friendship or hospitality. You always extended hospitality to someone, even if you did not know them. You invited them into your home and fed them. So an important part of society. Arete, which we will see when we read the Iliad and the Odyssey. This means excellence or ideal. So the arete was what men did to be that excellent, in most cases, excellent warrior, and to bring glory to their name and glory to their family and to their country. And then Odios, which is storytelling. This word means a bard or a storyteller, and it was very important in a society where they don't have a common language, and so everything is passed down orally. And we will see this again in the Iliad and the Odyssey. Like the government and the society itself, nothing about the religion is centralized either. There is no central body of information, and the teachings are very contradictory. It is said that what was consistent about Greek religion was its inconsistency. The various stories about the Greek gods and goddesses, it is polytheistic with many different gods and goddesses. There are various stories about all of them that kind of contradict each other. For example, Zeus. There are contradictory teachings about him. He is the main head god. He is married to Hera, who also seems to be his sister. And in one account, you will have him being very moral and setting a moral code for the Greeks. And another account that you read, you might have him having, 10 different wives and 20 different women on the side. So it's just not consistent. There is chaos among the gods. They are usually fighting with one another over something, over power over humans, over various women. And while there's chaos among the gods, there's order among men. So it is quite different than the way we might think of religious teachings. Religion was important to the Greeks. It did unite their society, and it provided explanation for a lot of the natural events, and it gave illumination to men's lives. Questions like, where did we come from? Why am I here? What happens after this life? Those types of questions that are common in all societies were answered by the Greek religion. It is a collection of myths and folk tales that were told orally, and this may account for why there are some inconsistencies in some of the storytelling, but Greek mythology is far-ranging and includes tales about certainly the gods, Zeus and the 11 other main gods, but also about how the world came to be, how the gods came to be, and what was important in society. There is a table in your book on page 49 of Zeus and the 11 other main gods. A great source of the Greek mythology comes from Homer. Homer was a writer who lived sometime between 700 and 900 BC. He was during the dark ages of Greece. These stories that had been told for many years, he wrote them down. Tradition of oral storytelling, and then he wrote it down. A lot of different cities claim him, but it was on the island of Lesbos where he came from. And he wrote down the story of the Trojan War several hundred years after the Trojan War occurred. There was an actual event in which Troy was destroyed in 1184 BC. So we do know from historical and archaeological accounts that there was a war. And then Homer wrote down the events that had been told orally, that were the tradition of the Greek people. And it educated the Greek people. It let them know where they came from and gave them a united history. He wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey approximately about 800 BC. He was believed to be blind, so obviously he had some help in writing down these stories. And he employed a lot of poetic traditions that are associated with epic poetry. And we will talk about that a little bit more. And also we will talk about it in class. As I said earlier, a lot of the literature and artwork concern Greek mythology, which includes the Iliad and the Odyssey. And so what we have here is a painting that was on a Greek vase that was found and related back to this time period. And this painting accounts a battle between two men during the Trojan War, a Trojan and a Greek. And if you'll read what's under it, this is the account that's actually in the Iliad about that. And this is typical of what you're going to see in the Iliad, which is a poem about war. There are a lot of battle scenes and there are a lot of gruesome scenes, as you see here, where we have a very graphic accounting of the killing of a man. And then we also have the sentence, in the melee he toppled him like a tower. So we have a lot of, that is a simile, and we have a lot of similes in the Iliad. They're called epic similes, and we'll talk about the epic in the next slide. Both the Iliad and the Odyssey are considered epics, as was the Epic of Gilgamesh that we read. And an epic is a long narrative poem. There are about a dozen characteristics of the epic. I'm just focusing on the main 5 here. First of all, for the Homeric poems, which would be the Iliad and the Odyssey, we have the Homeric epithet, which is where he refers to the main characters with some little phrase that describes that main character. For example, Achilles is always called swift-footed Achilles. Hector is always called breaker or tamer of horses. The goddess Athena is always referred to as gray-eyed Athena. So that is something particular to the Homeric epics. Also, as I mentioned earlier, we have epic similes. The simile is a comparison using like or as. In an epic, it's usually expanded 2 or 3 sentences rather than 2 or 3 words. We have the history of a people. It tells the Greek people where they came from and what happened before. Vast in setting, so it takes place over a large land area, usually all of the known world and the underworld, and vast in scope over a large amount of time. We have a strong theme in all of the epics. With the Epic of Gilgamesh, we discussed the theme of responsibility, of friendship, searching for immortality. In the Iliad and the Odyssey, we have strong themes of, again, responsibility, of friendship. We have warfare, of course, and then we have forgiveness and redemption and finding your way home. In both of these Homeric epics, we have supernatural elements because the gods and goddesses are very involved in everything that goes on in the lives of the humans. The artistic style of this period is called geometric because of the prevalence of abstract motifs in face painting. And most of our information about art from this time period does come from painted vases. There are 2 types, the proto-geometric, which has abstract geometric designs, but very clear and orderly. And then just the geometric, which has linear designs, and then meander, which means maze. So it's not as clear or ordered as the proto-geometric. And during the geometric period that came, a little later, as you see here, and which occurred during the time that Homer was writing down the Iliad and the Odyssey, that's when humans and animals appear. We saw a couple of slides earlier the scene from the Iliad that came from a vase, and that would have been during this geometric time period because that's when the humans and animals appear on the vases. During this time period, there is an emphasis on realism, so in realistic battle scenes, on real depictions of people and of the gods and goddesses. And a particular type of vase was the Dipleon amphora, which is what they used to carry water and wine in. It was a carrying vase that was lined with rosin so that the water or wine would not leak through, and it was particularly used for wine, and the rosin inside gave the wine a specific flavor. I do want you to note the vase in your book on page 53, figure 2.9, which has a painting on it of Hector. He was one of the Trojan heroes after he was killed by Achilles. And then I want to point out this one in the slide because note that it was not found until 1938. So they are still finding pieces that came from this time period, and they have dated it back to 450 BC. Notice the human figure we have at top, and then it was used to carry water or wine and made out of bronze. As the polis or city-states grew, they just continued to grow and fight with one another, but there came to be an accumulation of wealth in these city-states, and in so many people there was an overpopulation, so the logical answer was to colonize, was to spread in all areas and find new cities to live in, which would bolster their wealth. They went all areas, they went south to Egypt, they went west to Italy and Sicily, but mostly they went to the Near East. So they went east and came in contact with the Phoenicians, with the Persians, with a very different type of art and type of culture. And this culture greatly influenced the Greek artist. So much so that the new style of vase painting became known as Orientalizing. And there are 2 types of Orientalizing vases. The Corinthian type, which is associated with the city of Corinth and really brought a lot of wealth into Corinth. This was a miniature style of Eastern artist. The motifs were Eastern with vivid colors and designs. It was very popular, and as I said, it was crucial for the economy at Corinth. In the Athenian type, which of course is crucial for the economy in Athens, less change from the geometric type, not as vivid. There were large vases. They were a little more clumsily painted. They did have a depiction of animals and humans. And then the vase painting, the painting on the vase itself, we have 2 types, the black figure style and the red figure style, and this would be referencing the humans. Obviously, The black figure style had humans done in black, and this came first. And then later on, the red figure style had the humans that were done in red, the color of the clay, with the details filled in using a brush. Here we have an example of an early black figure Attic or Athenian vase or amphora. Remember that an amphora is a vase used to carry water or wine. And this is, from Athens, you see that the figures are in black, so we have the clumsy depiction of humans and animals. And this is a story from Greek mythology. We have Hercules here killing the centaur Nessus. Here we have another Athenian vase. This is a red figure. You can see that the humans are done in red, and this depicts Hercules defeating King Vossarus. And it is a peleik, similar to an amphora, but you see it's a little shorter and a little squatter. They're not sure exactly what the peleiks were used for, but they are similar to the amphora. Greek sculpture probably began during the age of colonization because we have the Egyptian influence on the earliest Greek sculptures. And this is the beginning of sculpture for the whole world. These are stone statues life-size that we will see repeated over and over and over throughout this class, and of course they are still done today. But the earliest, as I said, have that Egyptian influence. You can see the picture on page 60 in your book of the hair and the eyes that show that Egyptian influence. And then soon after we had the Kore, which is a female statue, which is female and clothed, and then the Chorus, which is a male statue that is nude. And then we move very quickly, really, from the earliest of the Greek sculptures into the archaic Greek sculptures. They are more rounded, they're more realistic, they show a more careful study of the human anatomy, and then they are particularly characterized by something called the archaic smile. It is a smile on these statues that looks really a little creepy, and it's on all of the statues. You can see an example both on page 60 and page 62 in your textbook. Both the Kore and the Chorus were used as grave markers and also to decorate the temples of the gods and goddesses. Here we have a Peplos Kore that was used to decorate the Acropolis in Athens, and it's called the Peplos because of the woolen garment that she is wearing, which is called a Peplos. There are traces of paint on her that show that they did paint their statues, and of course most of it has rubbed off, and this is an example of a Kore. Like the chorus is also carved in marble, and you see here the realism of the musculature throughout and of his anatomy. The Greeks did like the male anatomy. They mostly did the statues of the males in the nude. At the beginning of the Olympic Games, which was during this time period, the males competed in the nude. They did glorify the nude body, which is why you see the difference there. So this chorus is very realistic, and this is presumably of a man who died in battle. And so this was used as a funerary monument at his gravesite. Note also the archaic smile, like we saw on the Kore, that little half smile that is characteristic of this time period. This particular Greek statue is significant for a couple of reasons. It's called Critias Boy, and it's also from the Acropolis in Athens. And it's significant. It's the turning point between the archaic and classical periods for two reasons. One, the smile is different. We don't have that little half smile like we had before. And two, the statue is moving. We see he's not just looking straight ahead or walking straight ahead. His weight shifts and his hips move, and so that creates different musculature on the statue. As we prepare to talk about the Greek temples, just a note about the carvings that we will see on those Greek temples. We have high relief carving, which is three-dimensional, and really it's the large-scale statues that we have just been talking about that you will find on these temples. And then we also have the carved stone slabs, which are large and high relief because they're completely carved out of the stone. And then the low relief, which is on a flat surface, and more like the steles we had in chapter 1, the stele of Hammurabi that we had with, all of the law code on it. They're flat like that, and they are individual carved stone slabs and usually on a block of stone, and the part of it is left as background. The Greeks of this time period are particularly known for building all of their temples. The Greek temple was influenced some by the Egyptians, but primarily by the Mycenaeans. Remember that they built these temples to honor all the various gods and goddesses. The Mycenaeans used a post and lintel structure. The post would be the vertical columns, the lintel would be the horizontal piece that connects these columns. And so this was used all over Greece. And the types of temples were named after the types of columns, or the lintel part. So the Doric temples were named after the Doric columns, and the Ionic temples were named after the Ionic columns. As I talk through this, it will help you if you turn to page 67 in your textbook and look at the drawing there, so you can see the different parts of the post and the lintel. The Doric columns were very simple and grand. There was no base at the bottom. They just flat on the floor of the building, and then they tapered to the top. The capital had two parts. The capital is at the top of the column, and that's kind of a decorative part. There was a plain architrave, which is on the lintel that goes crossways. It was very plain, and then above that, the frieze had the decorative part with the triglyphs, which is a three-part design, and then the metopes, which in this case is plain, but then later they're decorated. And then the pediment, which is above that, which is the beginning of the roof line, is also plain in the Doric architectural style. Here is an example of a Doric temple. You can see that the base sits flat on the floor of the temple. You see the column as it tapers upwards, the capital that has the two parts, and then the architrave plain, and above that the frieze, and then that goes into the pediment. I like this example of a Greek temple that was found in Sicily because you can clearly see the triglyphs and the metopes there on the architrave, and then you can see the plain pediment, and I think it's easier to see here the tapering of the columns. Here is just one more example of a Doric temple. You can see more clearly the top portion where the column ends with the two parts of the capital, the rounded part and then the square part. Then you have the plain architrave, and then you have the frieze with the triglyphs and metopes. Here we have the best example of a Doric temple. This is a Parthenon that is in Athens, Greece, and of course can still be visited today, built to honor Athena. And we will talk a lot more about this temple in the next chapter, but I just wanted to make note here that it is a Doric temple. The Ionic temple is named after the Ionic architecture, and it does occur a little later than the Doric. Most Ionic temples date to the 5th century, and they are widely used in classical Greece, which we will study more in chapter 3. So they're named after the Ionic column, and let's look a little bit at it. Again, page 67 in your textbook. It is more graceful and elaborate. There is a tiered base instead of sitting flat on the floor. The capital, which is the top portion of the column, does have a pair of spirals. They are called volutes. Instead of being more plain like we have on the Doric, they're fancy with the little curlicues there. The architrave, instead of being plain, has 3 bands on it. And then the frieze is a continuous band that would have either low relief carving on it, telling a story from some Greek myth, or would have actual 3D pieces of sculpture there on that frieze. And the pediment was much more ornate, much more decorated than on the Doric column. Here we have an example of an Ionic temple with that Ionic column with the 3-tiered base. You can see at the bottom, the column itself is smaller, it's taller and thinner than what we have with the Doric column. The capital with these spirals or volutes at the top, the 3 bands on the architrave, and then a more decorated or ornate pediment. Here we have the most famous of the Ionic temples. This is the Temple of Athena Nike. You can clearly make out that Ionic column with the volutes, the architrave, the pediment. You can see how decorated the architrave and the frieze is above that. And this is located on the Acropolis, which is a large outcropping of rock above Athens, Greece, and there are several Greek temples on this site. The Parthenon is the most famous of those, but also this is where the Temple of Athena Nike is located. The history of Greek music and dance is much more difficult for us to understand because there is not as much left as, of course, there are the temples and the architecture and the vases and the sculpture. We just don't have much left, and what is left is hard to read because we don't understand the notations that they used in their music, and of course we don't have any videos of their dance. So scholars have tried to reconstruct what they can of music and dance. They do know that music was associated with the divine, that it said that the gods and the goddesses invented the instruments and the songs. And they do know that music for the Greeks had a very ethical quality. Ethos, which of course our English word is ethical, but they associated music with a strong ethos and believed that certain types of music could make you act in certain ways. For example, Dorian music produced firm, warlike feelings in a person, and Phrygian music produced very passionate emotions in a person. Terpenter was established as the first musician during this time period, and then we know that the instruments that they used were the cithara, which is somewhat like a harp, a lyre instrument with strings, and then the aulos, which is like an oboe. The vocal music, they had the paean, which is a solemn invocation to the gods, and then the dithyramb, which is a choral hymn that was sung to honor Dionysus, the god of wine. More on the dithyrambs in chapter 3. Dance. The Geranus or crane dance is said to have been performed by Theseus when he killed the Minotaur on the island of Crete in the home of King Minos. He came from Athens to kill it because 7 Athenian boys and girls were being sacrificed every year, and so someone had to kill the Minotaur, and Theseus, one of the Greek heroes, killed it and then afterwards performed this crane dance to celebrate. So music was important because they believed that music was so powerful that it gave the ability to alter human behavior, but there's just not as much left of Greek music as we would like. Here we just have a low relief carving showing the ancients playing their instruments. You can recognize the cithara and then a flute-like instrument. Besides the epic poetry that we have already touched on, you can associate 3 different things with the literature of the ancient Greeks. Hesiod first. He wrote a public account of the origin of the world. It is called Theogony, and then he also wrote a much more practical work called Works and Days, but he is most associated with Theogony. Lyric poetry was the other type of poetry they had, and the definition of lyric poetry, if you have not studied it before, is a brief, subjective poem that is marked by imagination, melody, and emotion. The person associated with lyric poetry during this time period was Sappho. And it's interesting because she is a woman poet who lived on the island of Lesbos. She was a wife and a mother, but she also was a teacher and a poet. She instructed younger women and had deep relationships with them and instructed them in what they would encounter as they became wives and mothers themselves. And so we have a lot of her poetry that just shows such a feeling, such emotion and such feeling that she has with her students. Philosophers of the Archaic period turned away from religious teachings for the first time in history, and instead they used the power of human reason to discover how the world came into being and how it works. The word philosophy means love of wisdom, And there are several different branches of philosophy that developed. First of all, logic, which, arguments, metaphysics, which means the nature of reality, epistemology, which is the theory of knowledge, ethics, moral philosophy, aesthetics, arts and music, and political philosophy. So all of these branches of philosophy had their beginnings during the early Greek period. The pre-Socratic philosophers are so called simply because they came before Socrates. They all died well before Socrates was born, and they really don't have anything in common except the fact that they were born before Socrates. The materialists are a branch of philosophers who sought to explain phenomena in terms of one or more elements. The most important of these was Thales, and he was the first to break from traditional values. And then we have Pythagoras, or the Pythagorean branch of philosophy. Pythagoras you may associate with the Pythagorean theorem, and that is true. He had quite an influence on mathematics. That was where he had his greatest impact. But he also believed, from a religious standpoint, in transmigration and the kinship of the soul. And in addition to mathematics, he is the one who also invented the octave, which is used in music to this day. The dualists believed in two separate universes, the world around us and the ideal world. And this comes into play in the next chapter as we talk about Aristotle, Socrates, and Socrates. And then we have the atomists, who believed in the ultimate unchangeable reality that just consisted of atoms and the void. Besides Homer, the most well-known personality of ancient Greek life is Herodotus, and he is known as the father of history. He is one of the greatest storytellers in the world, and he liked to write about the people who were involved. He doesn't always get the facts right, because he tells the stories more in terms of personalities. For example, he talks about hubris or pride that led to the Greeks' victory over the Persians. He did write the history of the Persian Wars, and he's known for that. And if you're a history major, you certainly would have studied Herodotus.